but I can also play animation. So as this is animating, I can move my camera up and down, I can rotate it around. Get really seasick, that sort of thing. So this is a very cool shader for doing sort of closed circuit TVs, or in this case, you know, a little screen on a device that's recording something else. It's also great for abstract effects. So a very cool sort of new shader available for Ciniversity through MoGraph 2. Now I'm just going to delete this object here so that you can see the scene a little bit better and focus on one more thing that's happening in here, which is this ball that's spinning around. This is one of the big new features for 11.5 and MoGraph 2, and that is what's called mode dynamics. So you'll see how this ball sort of bounced around and eventually landed and stayed in the groups. This is a very simple example of mode dynamics. So let's go over to our mode dynamics folder here and grab a few scenes. Now I'm going to start with just the simplest of scenes here to explain what mode dynamics is. Mode dynamics is a dynamics module or system based off of the Bullet engine, and what it allows us to do is use dynamics on MoGraph objects. And that's the very important thing to understand, is that we've got two objects here, a cube and a sphere, that we're going to apply the MoGraph rigid body tag to. So this is mode dynamics is implemented through this tag, but you'll notice that the sphere is actually inside of a cloner object that's set to one clone. Now you notice that when I apply the same tag, it actually has different icons. This indicates that this is going to act as a colliding object, and this is actually a dynamic object. So you'll see it says dynamic there, whereas this one just says enabled. Okay, so the tag is very intelligent as to what kind of objects it's applied to. Now if I press play, notice the sphere falls, but the cube doesn't. That's entirely because MoGraph objects can be dynamic, whereas standard objects such as the cube and floor can only act as colliders. So now let's jump into some real-world scenes here. We're going to start off with a picture, and this is, of course, one of the models from the broadcast edition. And I'm just going to select the model itself here so you can see how this is modeled. It is actually a single polygon object, but it has several fragmented areas in it. So the great thing about the Modyne system is that even though it only works on MoGraph objects are quite flexible in terms of how they can handle polygons and such, so that we can sort of use and abuse the system here. So right now we've got this inside of a fracture object set to explode segments. What that means is that every separate polygon group is able to be treated as a separate dynamic object.
To answer your question, Bud Orange is asking if this is supposed to replace the dynamics module. No, it's not replacing the dynamics module. It's providing dynamic capabilities specifically for the MoGraph module and the MoGraph objects.
Right, and one important thing I would mention with that is that they are two separate systems in terms of how they work and the calculations. So the dynamics system still uses a solver object you place things in, and it has soft bodies, that sort of thing. This is limited to rigid bodies, and it doesn't have convex collisions of dynamic objects. Only the collider objects can be convex geometry, which means holes in the geometry, that sort of thing. So there are some differences between the two. So as I'm playing this, you'll see how right now this object is splitting apart because of those fragments. Now the nice thing about Modyne is that it's aware of MoGraph objects and how they handle hierarchies. So because we have all these separate objects, what if I wanted to treat this as a single object? Well, I can basically go to individual elements here and turn it off, and now you see that when the ball hits it, that timing was too good there. As the ball hits it, the pitcher is treated as a solid object, right? So it just knocks it straight back. Then we go back to that top level, and when it restarts here, it's now able to shatter that object. So you can handle these so that they stay solid and then break at a certain time, because everything is animatable here. So that's a very simple scene. Now let's look at how this can be utilized with MoGraph setup. So we're just going to jump to a pyramid here and watch this crash for a second here, and then I'm going to stop it and show how the scene is made. So if I just back up here, what we've got is a single object, or actually, sorry, two objects, two different cubes, one that's a pillar and one that's a top. And they're positioned in a specific setup, so one is on top of the other. And then we have a plane object. It's actually a group of planes that have been connected together. What we're doing with this plane is using it to position each of these little pillars using the cloner object. So we've got it cloned to the polygons of the plane object. So this makes it very easy to build this structure. And then using the dynamics, these objects will all quickly settle. So if I just play for a second here, you'll see how everything sort of settles down for a few seconds. This is one of those things where usually you want to have some negative frames to sort of pre-settle things. But what's able to happen now is we've got a nice sturdy structure, and we have a sphere, again, inside of a cloner object so that it can be treated dynamic, that's sent flying towards the structure and is able to collide with it. Now you'll notice as it's colliding, all the elements are treated as separate elements, so the tops and the bottoms break off of each other. What if we needed these to be a sturdy structure that were connected to each other? Well, again, we can go into that individual elements, and you see how it's set to all. Instead, we could set it to something like off, and now when it hits it, you'll see that it treats it as one sort of solid object there. Instead, we can go to top level, and now when we press play, you'll see that it's actually knocking all these objects as though they're one solid component. So a lot of control over how hierarchies are handled with this system, allowing for a lot of different looks. And the nice thing is that usually when you have dynamic systems like this, to build these kinds of scenes where you have lots of bricks on a wall or something takes a long time, but with MoGraph, these kinds of structures are very easy to build. So I'm just going to jump to one more scene that we've got here for this, which is a more real-world example. This is a blood flow scene made by Patrick Goski, and this will be a tutorial on Ciniversity. And one of the things I love about this scene is this is very similar to something that one of our users presented at SIGGRAPH 2009. Nucleus demonstrated how they sort of do a basic vein with blood flowing through it using MoGraph. But the great thing is now with MoGraph 2 and Modyne, they have the ability to take this a step further. So here we have some cloners that are making all the cell walls here, and we have all the blood cells using the cloner as well. And what you'll see is that they're following this path using a spline effector. Now, as I press play here, the first thing you'll notice is my system can't handle the scene very well because of how complex the geometry is. So it's a little bit slow right now to play in the viewport. I'm going to turn on render instances, and this is just a very simple example of how render instances is not only a benefit for rendering time, but because of how it handles objects in the viewport, sometimes you can actually see a speed increase there as well. So here you can see I can now play this animation without going into wireframe. Now what's happening in this scene is that while the blood cells are trying to follow the animation, they are affected by gravity, which is pretty cool. So what the gravity does is pull them down, but the animation tries to still continue. And that's a special feature of Modyne, which is that while we're using the bullet engine, we're using a fairly new feature developed in part with Disney for their bullet plugin that's called follow animation. And what that does is actually try to blend between animated values and dynamic values. So we can actually go from one to the other or mix them. So what's happening here though is we have this cloner that is our valve basically closing, and when it closes in, the particles get blocked and they collide. So even though they're trying to move with the animation, they are still limited to collisions and that sort of thing. So this is a very powerful example of what Modyne and using MoGraph with dynamics allows you to do. So that's sort of a general overview of all the new features. I guess we're pretty much free for any additional questions and stuff. We just switch over to our camera. And if anyone has questions, feel free to post them.
Our moderator has been addressing some render instances questions. I believe everybody can see the answers to that at this point. Were there any specific questions from the members of the press? We've been going over some of the features and some of the additional things for members of the press. This presentation was actually meant to be for members of the press. However, users are always welcome. So there have been more questions from the users at this point. But if there are any specific questions from members of the press, that would be great. PolyFX. Rob is asking what PolyFX is. What is that?
Good question. I keep forgetting to cover this one. Let me just bring up a simple seen here on screen. Just as a really quickie here, what I've got is a landscape object, and let's just boost it a little bit. We'll say 200 by 200, just so there's lots of polygons. What polyeffects is a deformer in MoGraph that allows us to easily break up polygons on an object. So with this applied to our object here, what I'm going to do is just raise the Z value, and each polygon you can see is sort of traveling on its normal. So a very sort of interesting effect at the moment. What this really allows you to do, though, is utilize things like fall-off. So I'm going to set a spherical fall-off here, and then, I don't know, maybe we'll change the size a bit. So you just select size and drop it down a bit so it shrinks those polygons and maybe pushes those ones upwards. So you'll notice only in the region that the fall-off is in, those particles, let's set this to be...
I was going to say it's kind of hard to see.
Set this to a color or something so we can actually see what's going on. There we go. Zoom in a little. So what it's able to do is basically push polygons around according to a fall-off. The other great thing about this is not only does it work with fall-offs, if I just set this back to infinite, you'll see it does it to the whole mesh, but this allows us to use the regular copy effectors as well. So in this case, we'll add a random effector. It's moving everything randomly, and then with the random effectors fall-off, we could set something like a cylinder shape, and now it's only going to affect those. Let's turn our other values here back to reset to defaults. There we go. So now it's only using the random effectors fall-off to randomly move polygons around. So this allows us to sort of utilize this with individual polygons of an object using MoGraph. So instead of cloning lots of objects, we can now just break off parts of an object. A simple example is in our Adobe tour that we did last year. We made a building where we actually cloned a polygon onto each polygon of a simple model. Now we wouldn't need that step because we could just take that simple model and blow up all the polygons off of it. So it's basically a more efficient way of doing this, and with Modyne, this becomes a really powerful workflow where you can shatter and blow things up and they'll all collide and that sort of thing. So a really sort of powerful combination is what polyeffects is for.
I think all the questions have been answered so far. Scott was asking if it's a MoGraph 2 deformer, or yes, it is.
Yes, that's limited to MoGraph 2.
Yeah. But we are, again, open to any questions you might have, if anybody has any specific questions.
Just for Rick's sake, since there's no questions here, I'm going to switch back to screen. We haven't actually shown this in any of the presentations, even though it's such a cool example. This is an example for the Modyne capabilities, and will be a tutorial on Ciniversity as well. This object is actually a preset in the broadcast edition, but we've replaced the textures with a very special texture here. So what you'll see here is a domino setup, and as we cut, you'll see that we're able to basically, just like in the movie V for Vendetta, we're able to sort of create the effect where dominoes reveal an image. And I'm not even sure how many clones are in the scene, but there's a lot of them, and you're able to collide them all reliably. There's no intersections or penetrations or anything like that.
Bud Orange was asking if the particles that the PolyFX deformer creates could be affected by
they're not treated individually as particles. I mean, they sort of behave like particles, and because of all the different effectors, you can do a lot of effects that you normally would with a particle system. But if you wanted them to be actual particles, like thinking particles, instead of using polyeffects, what you would probably use is a matrix object set to thinking to generate thinking particles, and then just clone onto each particle using that object. So there are still some ways that you can do similar effects, but this is specifically as a deformer deforming that mesh instead of a separate particle system. What does the force object do? I'm not the very good one at doing an example of that. It's an object very similar to one that we have in the dynamics module as well, that does Newtonian forces, or basically how gravity influences from one object to another. Let me just switch over to camera here. So basically what it allows you to have is have several dynamic objects, and they will influence each other according to their mass and size, and influence each other. I can do a simple example, but I'm not sure if it would be a clear example. So let's just go into a new scene here and grab a sphere and a cloner. We'll set it to be a grid array. Spread those all out a bit. And I'm also going to just throw in some random size in there. So let's turn off position and turn on some random scale. Hopefully there's no intersections happening, but basically what this allows you to do is if I make this dynamic, and I'm going to go into the main settings here, which are actually, if I press Control D, we now have a new Documents tab for the Attributes Manager, in which we have document settings as well as Modine settings. So I'm just going to set gravity to 0. That way when I press play, even though it's dynamic, they're not moving anywhere. And now I'm going to add a force object in, and you'll see how they attract to each other. So that's basically what it's for, is to sort of attract objects together. If we just set this a little longer and add some collisions to this cube, what I can do is now push them apart, but they will always try to attract to each other as much as possible. And then you can control the overall force of that. So if we set it to 25, now they'll pull really close to the point in which they just go right past that cube. So that's basically what the force is for gravitational influence. Think of it like how the Earth influences the Moon and the Sun influences the Earth. So it's pretty cool. If you go to the Maxon site and look for, I believe it's called the no keyframes, there's basically an animation that's showing for the example of MoGraph 2 and MoDynamics, and in there they have some spheres rolling around another sphere, and I believe that that's how they're doing it, is with the force object.
Yeah, just as a reminder, there are some great videos on the maxon.net site that outlines each of the different features. And there's also a series on Ciniversity showing off some of the new features. And we are working on additional tutorials that will be added. I went back to the camera when I was done talking.
Sorry. Yeah, I just realized, oh, I'm not on camera again.
Yes, it would be an easy way to model grapes. Yes.
Yes, actually, we do have a tutorial on Ciniversity about how to do grapes, and it would be interesting to update that now, since I know that one does have collisions in it technically. It would be cool to update it using this as well. And our moderator just posted the link for the no keyframes animation, which is a really gorgeous sort of project, very cool abstract project.
Were there any other questions?
Each particle instanced cloned. I'm not quite sure if I understand what you mean, Scott. In terms of the particles being instanced, are you talking like render instances? I should mention that both particles, simple particles and thinking particles, do have the ability to take advantage of render instances. In terms of cloning a particle using a cloner object, that's not really possible, but there are ways that you can use a matrix object and the cloner object to drive each other in pretty cool ways. And we've been playing around with that too, to try and make pyrocluster objects which are only capable of being particles, be dynamic. So we've been having little bouncing puffs of smoke and stuff like that. So we'll definitely have tutorials on that in the future as well.
Radio silence.
More questions?
We're going to give it a couple more minutes, and if there aren't any more questions, we will wrap up for today. We'll try to set up some sessions for next week, maybe a couple for next week. So keep your eyes on the front page of Ciniversity. We'll make sure that there's a link and times there, as well as you come back to the Ciniversity Live page. I'm sure we'll have a little notification as to when the next live session will be.
And as we've already said to other users in previous presentations, the cool thing about Ciniversity Live is that there's always videos playing, so you can come and watch those and see our SIGGRAPH Rewind presentations, as well as Release 11.5 tutorials from Ciniversity. And you can feel free to come in here and just chat with each other and get to know some other cinema users. So it's kind of a cool new way of getting to know each other. So definitely take advantage of that.
Yeah, and we'll try to in the future we'll try to put something up on Ciniversity where people can submit questions, and then perhaps in the future we'll have themed Ciniversity live sessions where we can actually focus on some of the questions that came up, and perhaps have project files built in advance to illustrate the answers to those questions.
To answer your question, Scott, I'm just trying to look at exactly where the option is, but I do know that the thinking particles have the ability to use render instances automatically in them. As for the standard particle emitter, the trick is basically that instead of putting your object into the emitter object, you put an instance object set to render instances and have that instance your original object, and then it will take advantage of render instances as well.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you very
again,
much.
keep your eyes out on Ciniversity, the front page. We'll make sure that we will put announcements up there for the next live sessions and how you might get your information in advance. Thank you.
One of the most useful features added to Cinema 4D with version 11.5 were the additions made to the picture viewer. It now includes a render history, allowing for easy comparison between renders. Additionally, you can use the A/B compare function to spot subtle changes. In the Layer tab, you can view and edit your multipass layers. You can even change each layer's blending mode. The Filter tab allows for adjustment of saturation, brightness, contrast, and more, as a quick way to fine-tune your renders. After finding a setting you like, you can use the Create Post Effect button, which will add a color correction post effect to your render settings. Your color corrections will now be permanently baked into your renders. For animators, you'll be glad to see that the picture viewer can now play back animations. You can even play back or scrub an animation before it's finished rendering. The picture viewer can now play and scrub audio, enhancing your workflow while working with audio-driven animations. The picture viewer's RAM player ensures accurate playback speed of your animations. New in MoGraph 2 is the MoSpline object, which is a generator that can work in two modes, simple or spline. The first mode, simple, has some easy-to-use controls that give you some nice line designs. You can also add multiple segments very easily. And additionally, you can use any of MoGraph's effectors or the basic particle system's fields in order to add motion to these splines. Here we'll use the wind field. In spline mode, you can give a source spline and have MoGraph draw along that path. Here we've combined the effects to get an interesting title. Added to the cloner object is the ability to use a rail spline when using a spline as your object source. You can see here that the volume spread allows us to spread out our clones as they flow along the path. The random effector now has a new random mode called sorted. With the default mode random, you'll notice we get more than one of the same card, such as 2 9 of spades here. With sorted mode, we get a random shuffle, but with no more than one of the same clone. Using the new coffee effector, you can actually custom code your own effector for use with the other generators in MoGraph. Here, we've created an effector that flips from one word to another automatically. Lastly, we have the camera shader, which you can use to take a camera's point of view and then apply it to another object as a texture. Here we have it applied as the screen of this camcorder.
Broadcast extension kit. You can see here the layout's a little bit different from the standard layout with a MoGraph tab so you can easily add your MoGraph objects. Let's take a look at the broadcast extension kit. The broadcast extension kit is essentially a library of 3D objects, MoGraph elements, example scenes, and other various resources to help make your life easier. Many of the 3D objects you'll find in the extension kit have parameters that you can animate. For example, let's take a look at this bowling alley here. So if I select the bowling alley null object here, you can see I have a controls tab. This allows me to specify what object should be my bowling pin, the number of lanes, and if I want to include dynamics for my bowling pins. Also included in the broadcast extension kit is a slightly updated version of the CS tools. So you'll find these throughout the broadcast extension kit in areas like cameras, lights, etc., etc. Elements from the broadcast extension kit can be used commercially and can be given to clients as part of a Cinema 4D project. However, you cannot distribute these materials unless you've edited them in your own specific projects. So be sure to use the File Save Project command when using the broadcast. With release 11.5, Cinema 4D's renderer now uses bucket rendering instead of scanline rendering like it did in previous versions. To see this, we'll just simply render our scene here. And you can see two squares here representing each of my cores. I'm on a dual core Mac. And you can see that they're going around rendering the image as opposed to the vertical lines that happened in previous versions. Bucket rendering is very useful because it helps handle memory better than the previous renderer did in older versions of Cinema 4D. There are a couple options for the buckets, and you can find them in your render settings under the Options tab. The two options are here down at the bottom, bucket sequence and automatic size, which can be unfolded to show width and height. Bucket sequence determines how the buckets will be drawn out in rendering the image. By default it's set to centered, and we saw when I rendered this image it did sort of a spiraling outward pattern. But you also have different options like left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top. Left to right will render from top down, left to right. Whereas if I set this to be top to bottom, it will actually render across horizontally from the top down. If you uncheck automatic size, it will allow you to specify a custom width and height for your buckets. So by default they're set to 64, but I could set these to be, say, 128. And if I render, you'll see my buckets are much larger. Now, when the buckets are larger, they tend to use up more memory, but they can also sometimes help speed up your render. So if you're finding that you're running out of memory, it may be a good idea to actually lower your bucket sizes. So we'll actually set them down to 32. And if I render, you can see the buckets are much smaller now. The one drawback to using smaller buckets, though, is that sometimes they can actually slow down your render a bit. So it's a trade-off between render speed and memory usage here. Another great new feature of 11.5 is the inclusion of render instances into the core. Render instances can be found in a variety of objects, including cloners, array objects, instance objects, thinking particles, and regular particles. You can simply select the object and you'll find a checkbox to turn on render instances. So let's take a look at how render instances will benefit you. In this scene I have a cloner with 150 clones of a tree, and this tree has 100 and some odd thousand polygons, so it's about a little over 12.5 million polygons. And if I turn off render instances, first with it on, you can see my amount of free memory is 2.4 gigs. If I turn this off, you'll see that even in the viewport, not even rendering, the amount of free memory I have has dropped dramatically, and it's still continuing to go. And as it continues to go, you'll probably see that I'm going to run out of memory here. But if I turn on render instances and go back, you'll see that once again it jumps right back to using only or to having 2.45 gigs free. So you can see that this is very helpful for even just the viewport. Let me bump this down to say 75, and I'll turn off render instances again, and let's see how far this memory drops. So it looks like it's stabilized to about 1.7 gigs free now, so it's using about 1.4 gigs without render instances just in the viewport. Now if I try to render this, let's watch what happens with the activity monitor. Right away it's just going to jump down and it's going to give me an out of memory error pretty soon here. Sure enough, here it is. It says I'm running out of memory. It suggests running in 64-bit mode, but I only have a 32-bit Mac here. So let's go back then, turn on our render instances, and let's go ahead and try to render. So you can see we've started our render now, and our memory usage is dramatically lower here. We're barely even putting a dent in what we had when we weren't rendering at 2.4 gigabytes. We're still here with 2.3. And you can see it's already begun to start rendering. Sometimes you'll find that render instances can actually help speed up the viewport as well as viewport playback. So let's take a look here. I have these cloners with render instances turned off. So I'll deselect them and go ahead and click play.
So the receipt on log line, it doesn't work.
No, I don't. Throw it away.
And that took about 8 seconds to get to the first 20 frames. So now let's go back and turn render instances on. Let's see what happens. So that only took about 5 seconds to get to the first 20 frames. So it's not going to be a huge, dramatic, epic sort of playback where you're now playing in real time, but it can still help. Check out my viewport navigation as well. It might look a little choppy because of the video compression, but I'm able to maneuver around this blood vessel very easily. If I go back and turn off render instances on my cloners, I'll find that the viewport navigation is much more slow and unresponsive. You also see that the Enhance OpenGL has to disable in order to help navigate quicker. So render instances can be very helpful with With Cinema 4D release 11.5, there are a few new options in the render settings. First, in the Save tab, we now support the DPX format. In addition to supporting the DPX format, we also now have a native PNG format. And if you've used Cinema in the past, you know that our PNG relied on having QuickTime installed, which meant if you were rendering out